Well, good afternoon. I'm Jason Grumet. I welcome you to the Bipartisan Policy Center's lively conversation of climate risk disclosure. What is it and how does it work? I am reminded by one of my favorite moments in American political history when Admiral James Stockdale, Ross Perot's vice presidential candidate in 1992, took to the debate stage and said, "Who am I and why am I here?" Our ambition over the next 60 minutes is to do a slightly better job of explaining climate risk disclosure, what it is, and how it works. I am fortunate to be joined in this initial panel by good friend Doug Peterson, who is the CEO of S&P Global, a role he has had now for almost a decade, since 2013. Our job is to set the framework for a conversation. We'll have an expert panel following us to dig in a little deeper into issues around disclosure and some of the information needs and opportunities. But it's going to be tough, Doug, for you and I, because for the next 15 minutes, we actually get to talk about three of our favorite things: durable climate policy, infrastructure investment and modernization, and the efficient deployment of private capital. So it's kind of, a Lollapalooza for the two of us. And let me just kick it off with just a broad question on climate change. I think we have not spoken about climate change, certainly in public, since before the election. Very different conversation happening now. And I wonder, what are your reflections on the importance of the recent climate summit, particularly recognizing the G in S&P Global? How important do you think this is for a domestic audience, but also for the global audience?
Well, first of all, Jason, thank you for inviting me and also for bringing this panel together today. I think it is a very critical time for climate and climate change. As you know, last week on Earth Day, the Biden administration led a group of countries around the world to talk about climate change. And there's two things I take away from this. The first is that the United States is back when it comes to climate. If you compare where we were 3 or 4 years ago when we had left the Paris Accord, when we were not part of the global dialogue around climate, we're now back with very aggressive targets, with targets that we've talked about reducing the carbon, the GHG greenhouse gases to a level of 50% below what they were in 2003. So this is a very big increase. And so you think about what that's going to mean for reducing greenhouse gas. That means America's back taking a very aggressive stance, almost getting into a competition with the rest of the world. Second of all, this plan has a lot of new approaches to it in regional aspects. There's a U.S.-India work group that's been set in place, a U.S. Latin American Caribbean work group that's been set in place. So these plans are very broad, they're very aggressive, they're deep. And so we're going to have to talk a little bit more about what are some of the details around it. One thing I want to just mention before we move on, I remember the very first Earth Day ever in April 22nd, 1970. I was in 6th grade, and we all had to bring seeds to school and plant trees in milk boxes, which we then put in the ground, and they turn into plants and trees. And it was all about ecology. So we've now advanced way beyond the ecology movement in the 1970s, now into a completely new movement around climate, which is a critical global imperative.
And Doug, I was going to ask whether you banked any carbon offset credits for that tree, but I'm going to assume that was just altruism at that point in your environmental career. Let's lean in a little more to the ambition of this exercise. I think you made the point that this is a very, very significant commitment. Our back of the envelope math says that the nation's reduced emissions since 2005 by about 12%. And therefore, we have to achieve about 4 times as much reductions in the next 10 years as we achieved in the last 15. That's a big, big deal. What's your reflection on whether we as a society have the capacity for kind of transition at that scale?
Yeah, I completely agree. It is a big deal. Our base case for reductions based on the information we've got at Platts and across S&P Global is that on the path we're on right now, we would have about a 27% reduction. So only about half of what the reduction is that we now are going to be targeting. And that is based on a really significant uptake in electric vehicles. It also means basically almost eliminating coal, a big decline in coal. It even assumes that there's some sort of a pricing mechanism on carbon. So if you take a step back and say, well, how are you going to get from that 27%, which is already a pathway that requires a lot of change? You're going to have to look at this across the board. You know that electric vehicles are only about 7% of the output of carbon in the United States or greenhouse gases. There's other sectors like steel and cement, the industrial and manufacturing sectors, about 31% of the carbon and the greenhouse gas emissions. So you can't just say, oh, we're going to do it all by everybody driving electric vehicles. You need to look at the manufacturing sector. You have to look at the power sector. Within the power sector, you're going to need to look at new technologies. New technology is going to be a critical part of this entire plan, and something that everyone's going to have to think about. What are those technologies that will allow us across the board of all the different sectors, power generation, manufacturing, industry, as well as transportation? How are you going to be able to come up with ways across all of those to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
All right, so that's, that is the opening bid. Recognize that, the administration describes a kind of whole of government approach. I think something that we have talked about in the past is that neither the public or private sector have the knowledge, the political power, or the capital to do this alone. And so I think one of the main themes that I want to kind of dig into with you on the way towards the discussion about disclosure is, so, the role of private finance. And maybe just as an entry point, the administration did lay out a kind of international climate finance plan as part of the larger commitment. What are your general reflections on the way that was designed?
Well, going back to the statement I made at the very beginning, this is the U.S. is back. The U.S. is taking a very important leadership role, and they've laid out a comprehensive approach to multilateral banks, the U.S. Development groups, for instance, the Exim Bank, the AID, other organizations that the U.S. uses around the globe for promoting and developing financial projects, for allowing capital to be deployed around the world. This is a very broad approach to bringing both the public sector capital into the climate equation, but also private sector capital, which is absolutely necessary for this plan to work. Because if you think about how long it's going to take, if we're looking at 9 years now, but in 9 years you're going to have to deploy a lot of technology and a lot of new type of infrastructure, and you're not going to be able to do it without a capital plan which goes alongside of this. I do think that the approach to working with multilateral development banks is really important, because as we know, after you talk about the United States and Western Europe and China and India, a lot of the other countries around the world that want to develop to the same level of the developed countries, they want to do that. And as you do that, you need infrastructure, you need energy. And when you need energy, coal is still a cheap source of energy. So included in this plan were, I think, a couple of very good developments where countries like Japan and Korea have said that they're going to reduce their coal. And in addition, they're not going to do any more financing of coal plants in developing countries. So there's some aspects of this that are promises that have been made about developing countries, as well as how you're thinking of the advanced countries and how they're going to be using finance, as well as finance as a way to promote climate, the reduction of climate to the 1.5 degree centigrade scenario.
So Doug, just in terms of the scale of this, there are a lot of different estimates out there. I think one I read recently was that there could be up to $1 trillion of private capital a year that could be deployed towards this transition to a net zero economy. Does that resonate with what, how do you think about the breadth of the opportunity here?
Oh, the breadth, it's very broad. If you think about just 10 years ago, there were only $3 trillion in the US that were invested in so-called sustainable investment strategies. Last year, that got up to over $17 trillion. Now, sustainable investment strategies are not just climate alone. They're also maybe ESG, environmental, social, governance, some aspects of those. It could be all the way from impact investing, which is focusing on a very specific type of investment class. For instance, organizations that are only bringing renewable energy to the market. So you could range all the way from that to something like the S&P 500 ESG fund or the ETF that's been launched. So there is $17 trillion already in the markets that's already deployed towards some sort of sustainable strategies. There are $1 trillion is probably a pretty good number. I'd put that maybe overlapping with what's available or being built up around the world also for infrastructure financing. So some of those could be overlapping. I don't want to double count. But I want to give you an example, though. In Japan, the GPIF, which is the largest single pool of investment capital in the world, it's the government pension system. They have taken on the last 3 years a whole new approach to investing in carbon reduction strategies. And it's really an energy transition strategy. They're not moving directly into what would it look like today to have a portfolio that's ready to be on the 2040, 2050, 2030 goals. It's how do you get there, and how do you look at companies that have come up with promises around their own carbon reduction plans. So something like that is an area where we're seeing around the world. So the private sector capital is there. It's ready to be deployed. It's coming from pension funds, from endowments, from insurance companies, from banks, from individuals. So there will be a lot of capital available.
All right, so let's go back to the issue of scale, because I think, from the standpoint, this is just about scale and speed, right? We are going to achieve net zero emissions. The question is it by 2050 or 2087? And if I think about the permitting process, I'm reminded of the B.B. King song that, we're built for comfort, not for speed. When we think about the investments that have to be made, and I'm remembering our work together on infrastructure and the extent to which the timeframes and uncertainty in infrastructure permitting was one of the real obstacles to that private investment. To what extent do you think the conversation is now starting to focus on the need to accelerate modernization of infrastructure? And do you think that there's going to be room domestically for what has been a pretty controversial issue if the goal is towards a clean energy future? Do you think we could speed up this let's build stuff conversation?
Well, the America's Jobs Plan, which was basically laid out a couple of weeks ago, includes a portion of traditional infrastructure in it, as well as some energy transition, electric system. It has broadband as well. But if you take a step back and look at the part that's more traditional infrastructure, along with the electric vehicles and the energy grid, those are things that are going to be necessary for us to upgrade the infrastructure in the United States. And you can do it along the way in a way that is going to bring cleaner approach to the strategy, to our economy. You can build new roads, which will be more efficient. You can build bridges, et cetera, will be more efficient. But you can also build a structure for our entire electric grid, which is going to allow electric vehicles to be more prevalent, but also have a higher approach to renewable energy as one of the main sources. But to your point, when you look at infrastructure finance, and you and I did these projects over the last 5 years, which I think we need to ensure that we're getting into the dialogue, we looked at what's the flow of a project. You go from design to build to operate to maintain, and you have different opportunities for financing along that. And you mentioned that there's always this problem with permitting. And if you only have 9 years to meet this very aggressive goal, you can't wait 5 years to get a permit to build a new bridge, or to build a new airport, or to build a new port, or to build a new electric grid system. You can't wait that long just to start the building. You can't design for 5 years and have a permit that goes on for 5 years. And as you know, you and I saw a lot of projects that took a lot longer than 5 years before they were even giving the permitting so they could start putting shovels in the ground. So this is going to be one of my key talking points when I speak with the US government, is they cannot just assume that they can put out these big plans and that they'll execute on their own. They have to look at this entire flow of design, build, operate, maintain, finance, and permitting is going to be one of the most important aspects of that. And the second aspect, which is going to be absolutely critical, is the financing aspect. The private sector is ready to step up. You don't just have to do this with a public sector finance that's approved through the Congress. There is a lot of private sector capital, as you and I just talked about, on the sidelines, or it's capital from US pension funds being invested in Canada and Australia and Spain and the UK, in airports and ports and other sorts of clean new infrastructure. So there's a lot to do here, and it's going to require leadership in Washington, a comprehensive approach to understanding the way all of these things link together. And I'm hoping that all the work that you and I did together and that you led for the last few years, we can actually get that into the debate, because if we want to accelerate this, we've got to learn those lessons.
Well, we are down to, I think, our last 18,000 copies of that study, so it's available for anybody. Just reach out to BPC. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and I want to just kind of roll a little bit towards the question of the rules of the road and what kinds of public-private collaboration is going to be necessary in order for the private sector to make these good investments. And I kind of two questions. I guess the first is just coordination. You know, if everybody's got their slightly own cultural, spiritual, religious, technical view of ESG or decarbonization, you know, what is it going to take to have enough consistency, both domestically but also internationally, in order for these investment resources to flow? And what do you see as the institutions that have the best potential to provide that kind of organization in these efforts?
I would start with groups like the G20. In addition, you have later this year the COP26, which is going to be in Glasgow. So there are organizations that are bringing together experts, both at a country, national level, as well as the private sector, NGOs, multilaterals. These are organizations that we should really be looking at to bring together the best of the best and the brightest, as well as the best projects and the best learning, so we can use those learnings across all the countries around the world. But I'd start with the G20. I'd talk about the World Bank, the IMF, they're leaders in the multilateral development bank world. You've got in the financial world, it would be valuable, and I know you're going to be discussing this in the next panel, it'd be valuable that we can also start heading towards more consistency when it comes to disclosure about greenhouse gas emissions and water and waste and chemicals and things like that, along with the other ESG factors. So this is where you get into the regulatory framework of organizations like IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Regulators, and then the work that they're doing with organizations like the IFRS, which is the International Financial Services Standards, which is basically the accounting standards board for international organizations. So we're going to need to look towards the G20, the IMF, and then these organizations like the IOSCOs and IFRS, and then finally, I would say that there's one of the organizations that's going to be quite important. I'm going to say it's a subset of the G20, which is the network globally of central bankers and secretaries of treasuries or ministers of finance. I think that there's a really good network there. All of them seem to have had the same thesis advisor at MIT. They all know each other very well. They've worked together over the years. You might have heard me say this before, my heroes of the financial crisis were the central bankers. They're the ones that stepped in. They were independent from the government. They stepped in with whole new ways to support economies, with unconventional guidance, forward guidance, with new ways to ensure that economies were supported. I do think that the central bank governors, the central bankers, and ministries of finance and treasuries are going to be really critical. They have great relationships, and they can do that also through groups like the G20.
I think they rarely get called heroes. The fact that you have their trading cards, I'm sure, means a lot to them. Domestically, Treasury seems to be taking a bolder kind of posture in the debate, recognizing all the different agencies that are involved, in kind of the U.S. rules of the road. Does that seem like a significant step for you?
I think it's a significant step, and I think it's also a natural step. If you recall, after the financial crisis, there was an organization put in place called the FSOC, and it is the Secretary of Treasury that leads the FSOC. So that seems to be, to me, a natural place for this to be coordinated in the dialogue starting from there. If you have the SEC and the CFTC and the OCC and the FDIC and Treasury all running around doing different things on their own, not coordinating with the global organizations like IOSCO, we could end up with a mishmash of different standards and financial approach to climate finance and other things. So I think the role of Treasury is critical. Janet Yellen also has a stellar reputation. She's well known globally. And I think that she's a great leader for this. And I think the Treasury is, from my point of view, this is an opinion, personal opinion. I think Treasury is a great organization to be leading this in the United States.
Well, I think that is a great way to kind of set up the next panel, because obviously for Treasury to do a good job, or any of the other kind of, alphabet soup regulators, we have to have some agreement about the data, right? What is the predicate upon which these decisions get made? What is the information that allows investors, both institutional investors and individuals, to be supportive of the direction of a decarbonized economy? There are some key strategic questions about, what does clean mean? Are we trying just to simply move past fossil fuels? Are we trying to reward the companies that are making fossil fuel use cleaner in that transition. So I think the manage what you measure is I think probably the theme of this next discussion. And so, Doug, I want to thank you very much for kicking us off. And now I can turn over the conversation to my colleague at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I should learn how to say that, the Bipartisan Policy Center, Tim Doyle.
Thank you, Jason.
Tim Doyle. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. As Jason and Doug just mentioned, the Biden administration is focusing on climate change, and it has become all-encompassing in many regards, in that they are taking climate change with a whole of government approach. So as we come up on the 100-day mark of the administration, how will it respond? I think it's fair to say that at least one agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, appears to be out front, at least with regard to climate risk disclosure. So before we get too far down that road, I want to introduce my panel here to discuss some of these issues. I wanted to thank, first off, Lisa Epifani, who is ESG Manager, Strategy and Sustainability at Chevron, Suzanne Klatt, Vice President of Environment and Sustainability at Prudential, and Richard Matson, CEO, Truscott, Chief Product Officer, ESG at S&P Global. Thank you all for your time and coming on this panel. And for the audience, please submit questions using live chat on YouTube or Facebook, Twitter, using hashtag BPC Live. And with that, let's just jump right in. So, as I mentioned, climate change is this past week has been on everybody's mind. And it has been the focus of discussion for quite some time, along with ESG related topics. This has garnered growing attention inside both corporate boardrooms, but also amongst a growing stakeholder community, how that's being defined. With regard to climate, what is the status, do we think, of the broader capital markets on climate risk assessment and disclosure? Why don't we start with Richard?
Thanks, Tim, and it's a pleasure to be here. So, I mean, I think there's a huge amount going on the international stage. You have a massive uptick in commitments to climate change. So over 70% of the world's GDP has committed to some kind of target on net zero emissions, usually by 2050 or before. And in addition, when you look at the companies signed up to net zero commitments, we're now surpassing 1,500 companies globally signed up to net zero commitments of significant scale. And in terms of the finance sector, well, you have banks, asset managers, and asset owners who collectively manage 70 trillion worth of assets, all signed up to net zero commitments. So there's a vast kind of set of commitment, if you like, in the world. And there's also activity on the policy front as well. So in Europe now, as of this week, 50,000 companies in Europe have new climate disclosure requirements to abide by. And you have a new and emerging set of taxonomies. So these are green classification systems that define what revenues and business activities are green. They will become mandatory requirements for European companies to report on the proportion of their revenues that are green. And in fact, there are now 19 different countries or blocks developing taxonomies, including Europe, China, Canada, the UK, and Russia. So there's a lot going on in the international stage for sure.
Perfect. With regard to this whole of government approach, as I mentioned, the SEC has requested information from the public about what extent should publicly traded companies disclose their climate risks. Could you briefly describe how you see climate risk assessment, and in particular, how your company has addressed it? Why don't we start with Lisa?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Pleasure to be here. At Chevron, we recognize that climate change is one of the world's greatest challenges, and we want to be part of the solution. And as Jason mentioned, one of the important aspects of a climate challenge is being able to measure and evaluate that risk and opportunity, and to try to understand and navigate the multiple dynamic and interconnected dimensions of risks and opportunities related to an energy transition means a lot of information. And so for a lot of years, there's been many groups with different priorities and viewpoints working on frameworks, protocols, recommendations, benchmarks, and surveys, all to prompt some level of reporting on climate change. And so on one hand, you may say, well, all these different climate reporting efforts indicate a lack of consensus as to what to report. But all this work also provides a very rich base of experience and learning that can be used to drive greater consistency and comparability in climate reporting. You know, over these many years, as people are trying to figure out the best way to capture climate information, companies from all sectors have been voluntarily reporting climate and other ESG related information. For example, at Chevron, we've been committed to transparency for a long time and have been voluntarily reporting climate and other ESG information for many years using what we call the IPCA Sustainability Reporting Guidance. IPCA is a global oil and gas trade association focused on sustainability. And today, in addition to IPCA, we're working to align our reporting with frameworks that have gotten a lot of traction in the financial sector, for example, like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, as well as the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, SASB. And so the TCFD framework really deserves a lot of credit because it helped bring everybody to a frame where we're all addressing 4 pillars that are essential to understanding climate risk and opportunities. That's governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And we know many of our investors at Chevron and across many sectors have been asking companies to use the TCFD framework to report. And the TCFD framework is relatively new. It was finalized in 2017. You know, I offer an example of BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager. In their CEO's letter to all the companies saying, we want you to give us a TCFD aligned report by the end of 2020. Otherwise, we're going to hold your board members accountable. So when your largest investor asks you for a TCFD report, that's in essence a kind of a de facto mandatory requirement to report. And so with that, you see a number of companies working towards more and more useful, decision useful climate reporting using structures like the TCFD. And as Richard mentioned, there's a number of countries that are building requirements to try to drive people to offer consistent and comparable information.
And Lisa, I know that with regard to the standards that you're using, I know that Doug in our previous panel mentioned that there's a number of them and talked about the consistency and in them. How many surveys do you have to review? How much time do you put into responding to or filing TCFD reports, sustainability reports, SASB? I mean, what just for the audience, what goes into that?
So it's a very rigorous, a lot of hours, number of cross-functional teams are dedicated to it. And so just putting together our TCFD aligned report, which is our 4th voluntary climate report that we've done in the past 5 years, is a huge lift that requires a number of subject matter experts across Chevron to put together the information, to have the review, to have the legal review. So it's an extensive effort just to put together the report. You also mentioned the raters and rankers, and they are very important because they offer a kind of a ESG score to investors and other stakeholders on how companies are doing on their ESG characteristics. Now, each of these raters and rankers have their own methodologies and they each have surveys. And these surveys, while similar, all have slightly different flavors of questions. So again, it creates a lot of burden for companies to report to all these surveys. Some of the leading raters and rankers that we are always spending our time responding to are MSCI, Sustainalytics, Bloomberg. I mention those because going back to the interesting numbers that Doug was talking about of money moving into sustainable investing, one of the ways that many of these funds are measuring what's sustainable is they're using scores from these raters and rankers. And MSCI, which I think is the largest of the raters and rankers, also creates indexes to say what is something you could invest in. And so there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that you have as accurate a response reflected in these raters and rankers. And it can be frustrated because sometimes they're using kind of data scraping to get information and you're constantly trying to give them the most updated information, which they don't always have, or you may not agree with something that they're characterizing. And again, there's no one to go to after you tell them why you disagree. They can say thanks, but no thanks. And so I would say it's a huge burden. And that's why, coming back to the original question of this panel, climate risk analysis, driving more consistency and comparability is going to be very useful so that raters and rankers are measuring companies and comparing them on a similar basis.
Right. Well, and that gets to another question that I have. And assessing climate risk, I know that one of the challenges is determining what to disclose itself. I know traditionally the decision is made by a company depending on its determined materiality to their business line. There is some concern that explaining that expanding what is disclosed outside the framework of materiality, or expanding that, for that matter, the definition of materiality, would put the disclosure framework outside the scope of the SEC's legislative and judicial authority. At least that is the claim of some members of Congress. So how do companies address materiality in their analysis of climate risk? And do you see a concern with expanding the definition of materiality? Why don't I throw that over to Suzanne?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Suzanne Klatt from Prudential. So as a financial services company, we have a minimal supply chain and an increasingly smaller footprint from our facilities perspective. But regarding climate change, we view it as a moral imperative as well as a financial risk. So looking at the totality of climate risk, Prudential has decided to proactively disclose information that is not material under existing GAAP definitions of materiality. And because of active engagement with shareholders and stakeholders, we have been disclosing our emissions data for almost 10 years. We've done that, as Lisa mentioned, TCFD for the past 3 years, and we've been reporting to CDP, formerly the Climate Disclosure Project, on our climate change disclosures since then. And then to further support our ESG reporting, we conduct a small triannual materiality assessment, and we ask our internal and external stakeholders for what they consider to be material outside of what we've discussed, the formal existing GAAP definitions of materiality. And when we did that, we conducted 6 confidential interviews with senior executives, and then we surveyed 53 internal stakeholders and 21 external stakeholders on how they would rank the 15 topics of most importance to Prudential's businesses and stakeholders. So of the 21 external stakeholders, 5 were investors from the same groups that Lisa mentioned, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And our stakeholders from that ranked 3 topics important and for us to focus on. That would be diversity, equity, and inclusion, customer engagement, and then climate risk.
I see. So is materiality, do you see for instance, the SEC looking to change it? I mean, I know that it's set, the Supreme Court's been pretty clear on what it was, but do you see that it being changed there? Or do you think that the definition of it will be almost changed internally by, for instance, shareholder proposals that want a broader sense of what materiality covers, or information outside of what otherwise would be material, to get a better sense of a company when they're making their investment decisions? I mean, how do you guys see that?
Well, for me, I'm not sure that's going to change right away, but I do think that there'll be increasing demand from stakeholders, both internally and externally, like I said, on what we're disclosing. And we proactively look to disclose things, before it's mandated by an authority, whether it be U.S. or international as well, right? I think we will likely follow behind what the European Union is working on and doing right now as far as investment decisions go. As a global company, that affects us as well because of the asset management business, the clients that we have in Europe. So.
Right. And Richard, I know that another issue that comes up is the approach itself with regard to the SEC and its disclosure requirements. Currently, on many issues, it's a principles-based approach, which allows certain information to be disclosed essentially based on a company's assessment of the materiality of that piece of information, let's say, that's disclosed. I know there's talk of changing to a more prescriptive approach, which would, many people think of as a bright line that results in all companies, regardless of kind of materiality, a bright line on that which is going to be disclosed, so that depending on the different, regardless of the company, you as an investor or a stakeholder will be able to assess that information across the line, or across multiple companies and across business sectors. So given the complexity of climate risk disclosure, which approach, the principles-based versus prescriptive, do you think would be most helpful to investors and other stakeholders? And and keeping in mind that there seems to be some kind of middle ground that's recently been talked about, which is that the SEC would set, instead of a prescriptive model or principle, would set some kind of minimal benchmark. So Richard, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to look towards is the International Financial Reporting Standard Board, if you like, the Board of Trustees. Currently, the foundation linked to the International Financial Reporting Standard is developing or seeking to develop an approach to creating a standard as to how you might report on sustainability topics. And what I would imagine is that they're looking very closely at a set of core metrics and indicators that would be applicable across all regions, across all companies of different types, different sectors, and different geographies. And the reason for that is because when you look at climate change, for most companies, 90% of climate impact might lie either upstream in your supply chain or downstream in how your products are used. And so, when you think about materiality, it really depends on the scope, whether it's purely area and operations you're looking at, or whether it's a broader impact potentially on your business in some way. And also the time frame. Over what time frame are you actually examining? If it's 1 year ahead, or is it 30 years ahead? And so I think that's part of the reason why the International Financial Reporting Standards are actually looking to develop a core set of metrics that actually form a minimum threshold for reporting on things like climate risk, but also other sustainability topics. So there are developments that are happening very fast. They're expecting to make some announcements in time for the Glasgow Climate Summit later this year. And indeed, that work is being overseen by IOSCO, the sort of securities supergroup, if you like. And so that's the one I would watch personally. And I'm sure that the SEC is observing that very closely in terms of what may come out of that group, because if there is an international standard for a set of core metrics, it would be possibly easy to adopt something like that. Also look to frameworks. So we mentioned the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That is already well established. There are 1,500 companies globally that are seeking to do that or have already complied with the requirements of that framework. And the final comment I'd make is, 90% of S&P 500 companies already produce a sustainability report. That is actually up from just 10% a decade ago. So there's already been quite a lot of progress made. Part of the challenge, though, is only 16% mention ESG in their SEC filings. So it's a question of where you want to see reporting, and also the scope and the time frame that really defines things like materiality. But I would look to also international accounting standards that will help shape the debate here.
Well, Richard, that's a great question and a great point that we may have to have another panel just to discuss the international aspect of this. But
can I jump in there for a second, Tim?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Please.
I think Richard brought up a lot of interesting ideas about the international panel, and it's very interesting that I think the SEC is co-leading a technical group of IOSCO to offer input to the IFRS. And an issue that I'm trying to learn more about is how the IFRS, this international accounting group, works with the US GAAP, because many US companies are reporting under the US GAAP system, which is not the same as the IFRS. So not only are we working towards figuring out more consistency and comparability in just climate information, but in the whole accounting system, overarching, is still going to be a challenge. And I'm really grateful that Richard pointed out that there are a number of companies that have been reporting on sustainability for a long time. I think it's very important that even before the SEC, for example, launched all its questions, there was a great deal of work underway on the industry level to try to achieve more consistency and comparability. At API, for example, we have a group trying to put together a climate indicator template that we announced as part of API's climate framework. And there we're really focused on a core concise set of climate indicators that can drive more consistency and comparability. So if the SEC does take a prescriptive approach to climate reporting, then it's going to be very important for them to look at the leading frameworks like TCFD, as well as all the industry work that's been done to develop what are the ways that we should all be measuring greenhouse gas for our sectors. Because I think some of the challenge too, and brought up materiality, is that it's different for different sectors, where in a textile industry, child labor might be a very material issue, where that is not the same for a different sector. And so there's a lot to unpack, and materiality has taken on definitions, very different definitions in different places. And the EU has even coined a new double materiality. So there's a lot of good work that's been done, but a lot of more work to bring together sort of the terminology and approaches so that we can actually track, in this case, climate performance, for companies to be able to make targets, and for our investors and other financial stakeholders to be able to hold us accountable on our progress.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Lisa, you mentioned dual materiality. There's also this concept called dynamic materiality, which to me seems like it's an open-ended definition that it pretty much means it can mean whatever the person using it wants it to mean, which becomes difficult for companies when there was such a bright line Supreme Court rule on what a company should consider material. I mean, as we all know, versus the case, because of the cases and because of the discussions here, one of the concerns actually the Supreme Court had in that, I think, 1976 case was that the stakeholders in that particular case, they are more talking about shareholders and or the investment community, would receive too much information, that companies would give so much information that a reasonable person wouldn't know how to sort through it to make an investment decision. Almost like one of my old law professors used to call outline dumping in an exam, where you just essentially spew out everything that you have. So I think that will definitely, be on folks' minds as we work through that. Lisa, bringing up the different third-party standard setters, obviously you mentioned SASB, GRI, TCFD, and there are others out there, and companies decide to use various ones for different reasons, which I know has for a mid to small size companies, even publicly traded ones, I've talked to them, and some of them have told me that they don't have the resources to respond to these on such a regular basis. So I know that there's a lot of people that are concerned about that. Also, I know you, in addition to API, EEI and AGA have also put together a framework. And so that begs the question, when it comes to what the SEC is doing, is it a good idea to have industry-led frameworks? And how, and I'll open this up to Suzanne as well. How does that work with SASB, GRI, and TCFD? Can they work together? And Lisa, I know you have some thoughts on this, so we'll get back to you. But I do want to ask Suzanne, what role should these third-party standard setters play in creating a benchmark for disclosure, for instance, with the SEC?
Yeah, I think it's a great and a loaded question as well, right? To your point earlier about the Supreme Court, that was about shareholders, and now we're talking about, stakeholders at large, which are both internal and external, right? So this expectation of kind of what is a benchmark for disclosure becomes a bit, blurred, because what our different stakeholders are looking for is just increasing transparency and high quality, accurate, and reliable information. And again, the problem with that is what each company is disclosing, even within one sector like financial services or insurance. You're getting very different disclosure practices of what may or may not be material from an ESG perspective as opposed to an SEC perspective, right? And so just like we talked about earlier. And the other problem as well is that it's broad and it's shifting, and these standard setters provide a variety of frameworks that for a lot of us just become like alphabet soup, right? So it's challenging as to which ones you'll look at, which ones you'll consider. And I think another piece that's important here too, is how you're verifying the data, right? So in 2019, about 29% of S&P 500 companies had some type of third-party verification of their data. And I think what this does, it avoids that whole greenwashing theme that we talk about and we hear about if you're verifying this data with some third party external. And I don't know that this is material for a financial services company like Prudential, but I think at this point it's become almost table stakes and expectations, as Lisa mentioned earlier, with like MSCI and Sustainalytics and Bloomberg. And the other interesting piece about this, I think, is that a lot of these different data disclosure points like CDP, MSCI, and Sustainalytics is on the Bloomberg terminal. So you sort of have to watch kind of what's going on with all of these raters and rankers. And so, I think it's a good question that, I'm not sure, where this will land as far as, a benchmark for disclosures. And it's very specific sector by sector in the approach of how you'll do this. And so it's a challenging feat, but, I think increasingly we're seeing a lot of these frameworks converge, right? We're seeing the IIRC working with SASB at this point. And so, this is hopeful for companies that are doing this reporting.
Right. And before, Elisa, I do want to circle back with you on the industry-led sector, but I do want to remind people to please use the live chat function on YouTube and Facebook, or if you're on Twitter, use hashtag BPC Live. Please submit your questions and we will get them asked. So Lisa, obviously, when you look at everything that's going on, the SEC is considering whether they're going to mandate some kind of disclosure. They're thinking about coming up with a standard. But as we mentioned just a minute ago, and you mentioned, industry has taken the lead. I think EEI was first, and then I think AGA, American Gas Association, then came up. Then I know that you're working with API. How important do you think the sector-driven or led frameworks are going to be in this disclosure discussion?
I want them to be very valuable tools for the SEC staff to understand each industry's measurements and approaches. I mean, each industry is responsible for driving that consistency. And this is where I think the challenge is for the SEC if they take a very prescriptive path in that they don't have a level of expertise. So there's an opportunity to take in what the industries have done. For example, at Chevron, we report our GHG emissions on both an equity and operated basis. We were one of the first in our sector to do that. And equity means you're aligned with your financial reporting, and it indicates your emissions from both your operated and your non-operated joint venture assets in which you have a financial interest. A number of companies have not yet been doing that. And one of the things that the API template drives at is making sure you label in the template whether those are operated or equity emissions. And that's the kind of level of granular detail that a very high-level principle-based benchmark might miss if it doesn't start to understand what's going on at that industry level. So I think this is still a relatively new area in terms of just climate reporting. There's a lot to still learn. We've made a lot of progress, and we are working through all the 60 questions that Commissioner Lee provided, and they are the hard questions for this whole area. And I think we're going to need some level of patience, but we need to work quickly at the same time because our investors need the information to make good choices. And at the end of the day, the reason we're doing this is to show progress towards the efforts to have a lower carbon future. And companies that are moving in that right direction are the ones that the financial sector is going to want to reward. So that's why, again, it always comes back to, why are we doing this? We're not just doing it to provide information, we're doing it to drive good decisions.
Right. And I should, for the audience there are a couple questions have come up. I think that, and we sometimes dig or get into the weeds so quickly without giving some background. And so I do want to make point of what Lisa just mentioned. SEC Commissioner Lee put out a request for information a couple weeks ago with its 15-part multi-questioned request for information on this. And when you look through those questions, and I would definitely, those that are watching that are interested, you really should take a look at that. The SEC truly looks like they are wanting as much information as possible to make an informed decision about how to move forward. And certainly hear rumors about that they're moving in one direction or other, but it sure appears with the breadth of questions that they're really looking for people for public input. And I know one of those issues that comes up quite a bit is how, even if they put together, even if they adopted their own framework, that how that framework or standard, how that standard would be, how the oversight of that standard would occur. As anyone just watching this can realize that there is an alphabet soup of standard setters and issues, it depending not only on sector, but as Lisa, I know you mentioned before, sometimes it's even within a sector. Companies have a different disclosure, different assessments of materiality of information based on their individual business line. So it gets very complicated very quickly. And sometimes I know those of us that are in it forget to come up for air sometimes and try to explain that to everyone, that this is not easy. And to Lisa's point, this is new. This is a relatively new area. Just because ESG is easy to pronounce and talk about doesn't mean that it is so. I did want to now I guess one quick follow-up, Lisa, question is, the industry-led benchmarks, frameworks that you're talking about, do you see those potentially going away if the SEC mandates something, or do you see that incorporated? Because I know that we've talked about this in previous panels. A SASB, for instance, has, in their very broad, very kind of large and whole-encompassing standards, they break it down by industry as best they can. I guess the question is, how does SASB different from, or how are you different than what SASB? How is industry-led standards different than SASB? Sorry, that took a look to out.
Well, SASB does take a sector approach, and they lay out questions not only for climate, but for social issues and governance issues. And there's a lot of merit to SASB's approach. We have actually indexed our data tables in the Chevron reports to SASB so people can see where we have similar or even same information available. What I think is different about the industry templates, like APIs, for example, is that we get very specific, where a SASB request for information around climate is provide a qualitative text describing your strategy. That's useful to know, but what investors want to see is that consistent information, so that, going back to my example of equity emissions, I want to be able to, as an investor, see what are your emissions on an equity basis and how have they progressed over these years, and compare them to another company. That granular level doesn't exist at that level in SASB yet, but the API template that we've been working on, we're going to be talking to SASB about it, because ideally they would incorporate some of these into the SASB template, again, to drive more consistency.
Right.
And a note to the building blocks effort that all of the different frameworks have, they recognize they need to converge because it's just proliferating, but they each have a slightly different agenda, and they're each directed to different audiences. And that's a big challenge, because in the history of financial reporting, you are reporting on your company. In sustainability, Richard pointed it out, you're not just reporting on your company, you're reporting upstream and downstream along the value chain. So it's different in nature. And so there's just challenges of trying to make them fit exactly the same. And when you even talk about if SEC were to do kind of a hybrid approach and put a benchmark in place, you're changing the lens of materiality from companies decided what was material under the securities law to where a regulator is going to say what is material. And that is a big change. And then maybe it's an important change that we have to consider. But again, it's a new idea and requires, I think, a lot of conversation and thoughtfulness.
Absolutely. And I think we'll get to the audience questions in just a minute. There's a couple I think that are going to hit on that point. But before we get to the audience questions, and Lisa, I don't mean to pick on you, but you know, when you're here, I'm gonna ask you some questions. So, as those of us paying attention to the news this past week, April 22nd, President Biden released his U.S. International Climate Finance Plan. That, among other things, increased the U.S. emission reduction target level to 50 to 52% from the 2005 level by 2030, which is a fairly aggressive reduction level. He also indicated in that morning speech the importance of technological advances, such as carbon capture, direct air carbon removal from the atmosphere, and reaching those targets. And we are here in DC, so I do have to mention that there's really bipartisan support. Congressional leaders, not probably surprising, Senator Joe Manchin, but also Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, John Barrasso, obviously Republican from Wyoming. And this is where it also, I think, is interesting. A number of CEOs, from GE to your CEO, Lisa, Chevron, Southern Company, Exxon, and even Microsoft founder Bill Gates have all indicated, for instance, that carbon capture is necessary to realistically, I think is the key, realistically reach these the targeted reduction emission levels. So, Lisa, to you, how important are these technological advances in getting us realistically to these goals by 2030?
Sure. I want to start with, we look forward to working constructively with President Biden and the administration on the issue of climate risk and opportunity. Chevron supports a global net zero ambitions of the Paris Agreement, and we really believe the future of energy is lower carbon. Our motto is higher returns and lower carbon. So at Chevron, we're taking energy transition actions across our business that are focused on lowering carbon intensity cost efficiently, increasing renewables and offsets in support of our business, and investing in the low carbon technologies like CCS so that we can enable the commercial solutions needed. Now, you asked, how important is CCS? It's very important. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense that President Biden would include that in his outline of what we need. But again, gets back to the hard part is, are we using the same definitions and measurement methodologies so that we can understand the real level of any emission reduction technology contribution? Chevron has been focused on CCS for a long time. We've invested more than $1 billion in CCUS research and development, and we operate one of the largest CO2 injection projects in the world in Gorgon in Australia. So again, I'd say President Biden's recognition makes a lot of sense. If you don't have CCS as part of the formula for reaching the Paris Agreement and a lower carbon world, it's going to be a much more expensive energy transition because the other technologies are not yet scalable or they're very expensive. They're going to grow, and we want to see everybody come and contribute. But right now, the IEA, not Chevron, this is the International Energy Agency, is sort of the global energy advisor, says that CCUS is a key pillar to a successful clean energy transition. And it talks about CCUS as contributing both to directly reducing emissions in critical economic sectors and to removing CO2 to balance emissions that can't be avoided. And it's that balance that's really at the heart of trying to achieve a global net zero. And so, again, understanding how a company's GHG mitigation activities like CCUS is absolutely necessary so that you can do a climate risk analysis. I'd also say offsets are going to be an important part of global reductions as well. And there too, there's a lot of work to ensure that we have that consistent and comparable foundation so that companies can understand their progress, and importantly, the financial sector can make decisions based on useful information.
Sure, and Richard, I want to circle back to you. I know we were mentioning what international standard setters are doing when it comes to disclosure. How, when it comes to technology and maybe even more broadly in how the rest of the world is addressing climate change and the targets that they have and the targets that they reach. I mean, the U.S. is leading the world in reduction and reducing emissions, and certain countries that we know, India and China in particular, are going to be, their emissions are going to be going up. So from a global perspective, how do you factor that into climate risk assessment? That although the international communities having these have these high benchmarks or high targets, realistically, how do you factor in countries either making those targets or not, I guess is the question.
Well, so, I mean, obviously we're going to need technological advancement. I wouldn't also miss the opportunity to say that there are, technologies, renewable technologies at cost parity or cheaper that will also grow pretty rapidly. So, for example, the IEA, International Energy Agency, would say that offshore wind in Europe will be the dominant source of power by 2040, and perhaps even earlier by 2030 on sort of the current policy trajectory, if you like. So I think that there will be huge technology advancement that is required, but some is already kind of at cost parity, doesn't need any further funding to deploy in certain parts of the world. And so that's what I think we're watching. We're watching the transition plans of governments, of countries, quite closely with respect to reliance on technology, how far away we are from technology or close, and how likely those plans look. China's plans, for example, China's net zero plans by 2060 require a halving of their emissions by 2030. They're actually pretty much on track for that. It's the next period that is extremely difficult, I think, because they will need a transition that is far faster than the transition the US has undergone so far. And so faster and deeper cuts over a shorter period of time. And so that's the challenge. For other economies, the challenge is actually a bit more near term. What we do in this decade is going to be the most important decade for most other economies. And so I think that's what we're appraising very closely, is the difference between a stated objective of net zero by 2050 and actually what needs to be achieved by 2030. And it's something that in particular asset managers and certain major pension funds are really examining very closely right now, is what is the trajectory of their portfolio on? And by our analysis, most portfolios are on about a 3.5, 3.7 degree warming pathway, when really they should be more in a sort of 2 degree or 1.5 degree warming pathway. And that's really a sort of a challenge, if you like, for major portfolio managers with broad exposure to the market, which is most global asset managers. And so you have a lot of asset managers currently using a lot of our climate data. We've got about 700 billion climate data points on more than 100,000 companies globally. And a lot of those organizations are leveraging those data sets to really understand climate risk, but also how far away are they and how far away are their investments from that appropriate pathway on the route to net zero.
Right. Yeah, and I know that, and I know the IEA has also mentioned hydrogen and nuclear, obviously being very important aspects to getting there. Carbon capture is just one of them. But it's interesting, bringing up China is, and I know that they have, per their agreement under Paris, they have a longer window, shall we say, to reach their targets. But to the average person that's paying attention, they're also building coal-fired power plants, all over the country. That so maybe carbon capture, although is more expensive now, maybe as more of those coal-fired power plants come online, carbon capture will be more important. But let's move on to a couple of audience questions, and let's start here. This is from Jack Andreasen. I hope that's right. And then this is something, Lisa, we talked about and others talked about. Question is, what is dual/double materiality? And is this a policy that should be considered in the US? I don't know if, Richard, you're on my screen, so I don't know if maybe you want to start with that.
I can maybe start. Yeah, I mean, double materiality is something actually that's been enshrined now in Europe in law, and essentially means that a company has to take account of both its impact on the planet, but also the impact of the planet on it. So its reliance on resources and things that including nature, for example. So you have this principle of double materiality, which is sort of both a kind of financially based concept, but also a sort of concept that is based on the broader societal lens as well. And that is something that means that certainly in Europe, a lot of companies now have to take that into account in terms of how they actually report. They can't just report using the narrow financial lens. They also have to look at the broader kind of societal lens, if you like.
Right, and of course they don't have a U.S. Supreme Court that they have to respond to, at least at this point. But I know that Suzanne, you had mentioned it too, that it has to do with broader. There are more stakeholders. The court was dealing with shareholders, and now we're starting to talk more broadly about stakeholders and their interests may not necessarily align with shareholders, which is a whole another subject. Let me move on to another question, which is this one is from Elliot Zorninski. I think that's right. Senator Pat Toomey said the SEC does not have the power to set up an independent entity or standard setter without congressional approval. How might this hinder, in this case, he says ESG, but climate risk disclosure or others in this space? Good question. I know that a couple, Commissioner Hester Pierce has made similar comments, Republican, as has Commissioner Alad Reisman, very much the same types of questions. So I don't know if that anyone wants to volunteer to take that one.
I'll try. It's a good question because again, this is a new area and I don't think there's a definitive answer yet on that. But what I think is more important is that the SEC can offer guidance. They have already done so in 2010 on climate disclosure. More importantly, our investors are asking for this information. So even if you took the SEC out of the equation, the demand for this kind of information has been growing very rapidly from the financial sector. And I, from my perspective, don't think there's a lot of difference between what the financial sector wants and what larger stakeholders want. They want to understand your emission profile. They want to understand how you're stewarding water. They want to understand the diversity in your companies. So all these sustainability reports that have been increasing, as Richard pointed out, are getting to that. And so it's a question we're going to have to grapple with in terms of what's the SEC going to do in the near term. But I think the path of finance pushing towards lower carbon, companies disclosing more information, we're already well on that path, and then there's no reason to think that direction is going to change.
Yeah, and it might be what companies are doing as compared to what the SEC is able to require. They certainly can. They certainly are within their, I believe, their right to provide suggested ways that companies can respond to this without mandating it, and maybe that's the issue, both for the senator as well as the other commissioners. Lisa, this one's going to be for you. This is from Cynthia Williams and dealing with carbon capture. The technology carbon capture has been under development for over 30 years now and has not gotten, and these are her words, not gotten feasible from either a financial or technological perspective. Is that wrong? And I think she's talking about whether it's scalable and whether it gets back to Richard's comment about it being the costs involved in it.
That is a fair observation that has been, CCS has been on the solution for many years. And I think what's driving the difference now is that everyone is focused on the need for carbon reductions. So the demand for CCS and other advanced technologies is stronger than it's ever been. And what I think we haven't touched on yet is, we talked about finance driving this lower carbon future. We haven't talked about the role of policy. And there, carbon pricing, I think, is going to be critical to ensure that governments are also contributing to everyone moving in the direction of lower carbon. And carbon pricing will, I think, underpin all the advanced technologies. So it will make CCS much more attractive as an investment. It will make all the advanced technologies even more attractive. And going back to what Richard talked about, that renewables are growing. We've been going back and forth to the IEA, and I think one of the things that the audience should think about is the sustainable development scenario that the IEA outlines. That's the scenario that many companies and I think the TCFD even suggest you use to test your portfolio. And the assumptions that the SDS, the IEA's sustainable development scenario has are very aggressive in this, or not aggressive, they're ambitious and they're designed to achieve a Paris-aligned world. And in them, they include things like much greater efficiency, renewable power providing 50% of the power, much fewer ICE, the internal combustion engine cars. And this one I think is the most interesting, is $140 a ton carbon price. So if you have all those assumptions, that's how the IAA thinks that's a pathway to reach the Paris Agreement. And so I point back to the reason I think CCUS has a real future is we have learned over the past 20 years how to do it. We've scaled it at our Gorgon facility. We have partnerships and investments. We're now learning how to also tie it to industry processes, which are very hard to avoid their carbon emissions. And so I would just call on governments to also do their part and offer a carbon price so that the world can keep working together.
Yeah, and we may be closer to that than thought. I mean, it's just listening to here in Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill, those that are talking about it have historically not talked about it. So it'll be an interesting topic, and I think one that we will come back to for sure. I do have another one, another question. This is it's from Mr. Andreasen is definitely paying attention here. He's got a question for us. And although, Lisa, I would pick on you because I think that you probably have some opinions on this, I'll open this to the group. And that is this. Given the difficulty and importance of accounting for Scope 3 emissions, and maybe we want to describe Scope 3 emissions, what they are for those listening, how do you see scope standards being developed in the coming years? And what is the most important in setting these standards? I don't know if anyone wants to take that one.
Maybe I can define it and then I can pass it off to everybody else.
Perfect.
So
Thanks,
so for those that don't know, Scope 3, there are 3 scopes, 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 and 2 are basically your operational emissions, both direct and indirect. And Scope 3 is indirect emissions from your value chain. So there's 15 different categories of Scope 3. So I'll speak for Prudential. The most significant one for us would be our investment portfolio.
Perfect. And I don't know, Richard, if you want, I mean, scope, well, to get a little background on Scope 3, I know that has been the most, shall we say, controversial of the 3 categories of emissions. Lisa, I don't know if you want to address Scope 3 emissions and kind of your thoughts as we go forward, given that more and more companies are starting to list those. And though people I think that are paying attention and watching should realize the difficulty of capturing what those emissions are, because now you're not talking about your own operations, you're talking about operations down the road and how you as a company are dealing with that. I don't know if you want to.
Sure. First, just some foundational to the kind of original question. The scopes have been defined within the GHG protocol. If I was looking back, it's the World Resource Institute and the WBCSD have long been developing how to measure GHG. And the EPA has had a program for GHG reporting within the United States. So again, there's a lot of foundation of how to do it. And yet, even with all that experience, as we were working on our API template, we found places where companies might put a storage facility in a midstream versus upstream. So it's small things like that, making sure that everyone's drawing their boundaries in a similar way that are not yet resolved. And these are like, we're getting to that point where we're having to deal with those granular aspects. On Scope 3 emissions, as Tim said, it can be challenging because there's in in unavoidable double, triple counting of it. And the example we often use when we're talking to people of just scope 3 emissions, if I'm Chevron and I produce a barrel of oil and I put it on a Kinder Morgan pipeline, send it to a Shell refinery who has it trucked to an Exxon gasoline station where an Uber driver fills up his car to take Tim to the airport, whose scope 3 emission was it? Is it, ours, Chevron, because we produce the oil? Is it the Toyota Prius, the manufacturer? And everybody on that chain is going to say, well, that's part of the consequence of my activity, so it's a scope 3 emission. And figuring out how do we capture this information in a way that is useful and reflects it. And it goes back to, Susan outlined that there's 15 categories. We're trying to be very specific, but it requires you to understand what's happening in your value chain. So one of the things that we're doing at Chevron is working hard to improve carbon footprinting information so that almost like you can read the calories on the back of your candy bar, you can understand what is behind that product you're buying, and you can make smart decisions. If you are a utility in Japan trying to buy a cargo of LNG, you can select that LNG that has the best carbon profile because it's been carbon footprinted along the value chain. And so again, this is kind of an interesting frontier area, and Chevron in our climate report talks about the work we're doing on it. It goes back to, if you don't have the equity emissions, it's really hard to do.
Right. And with that, I really wanted to thank the panel. Appreciate your time, the great discussion. These are topics that are not going away as the SEC is reviewing that which we mentioned before, Commissioner Lee put out a couple weeks ago. And some of the topics that came up today, I know that we are talking about internally, doing an event on the international versus US approach to this, the standard setters, who they are, what they are, and something that I think will be talked about for a very long time, and that is materiality, what it means and how it's used. So those stay tuned. Those very well may be subjects of future BPC events. So I wanted to thank the panel again. Appreciate the audience questions, and with that, wanted to say have a good day.